All right, today we're going to talk about a packing method where I was trained, it was referred to as guillotine style packing. It's also probably more generically referred to as contour brace systems, or sometimes they call them yoke systems. Basically it consists of braces that form a plane, almost always horizontal, that are cut in two pieces, a two-piece system, that you capture the front and the back between them. The materials you use depend to some degree on the weight of the piece and the context you're using it in. Meaning whether there's a difference between if you're doing it to where your box is the primary box, it's what's traveling as is, or if it's an inner container. In the one, you're cushioning around the object, with that being its only cushioning. If you're doing an inner box, then you're focusing less on cushioning, or actually sometimes the opposite, and doing your cushioning between the inner container and the outer container. Also, it can be used in a bunch of different circumstances though too. It's also not just a crating thing. It can be very handy in like lighter weight inner boxes, and even as a hold down method. The one thing that they tend to have in common are a channel that the brace slides in. In this case, I only have a bottom channel because I'm going to do two different kinds of braces. I'm going to do the ethafoam, which is probably the more common, and I'm going to do a plywood version. The first thing I'm going to do though is talk about how we're placing the object before I talk about the specifics of both finding the form and cutting the guillotines and covering the surfaces and all that sort of good stuff. What you're looking at right now is how a lot of beginning crate people would tend to do. There's a real mindset that you have to avoid when you're dealing with three-dimensional objects, which is to look at something that's artificially determined, like a base. So often people will tend to like measure from the base or place the object based on the base. And in this case we can see it's like that throws the whole thing pretty much off center. Right now it's like, oh, I'm spacing this all evenly, front to back and side to side. But that kind of pushes the object over. It also throws it off balance a little bit as well. So we need to make sure we get out of that mindset and be looking at what we're doing. You have to start thinking, when you look at it, how am I going to hold it? What points am I going to contact? And what do I need to avoid? And in this case, this desire to have things be, kind of rectilinear and parallel is going to hurt us, because in this situation here, I don't have anything as this top brace comes across here. I don't have anything on this side I really can touch. This hand is projecting. I don't want to put pressure on that to hold it. That would be kind of nuts. There's a good chance this could be broken and repaired. You couldn't even tell. So we want to figure, it's like, well, what can I touch and how do I get to it? In this case, it's a relatively simple thing, and this is a relatively simple form. All you need to do is rotate the piece. And there, all of a sudden, I have access to this shoulder. So my brace can come in and contact it here and over here, and then of course it'll be matching on the back side. We'll do the same thing down here. We'll have contact points here and here, and avoid this hand pretty much entirely. The only exception might be if it's really loose. Sometimes you might want to lock all of this in, but that's kind of the extreme end of the plywood version of this method. The next thing you're going to see is I have been sent out on site before with one of these cut in half. It's like, well, it's a two-piece system, right? So here's half, here's half. Well, unfortunately, that can be pretty detrimental, in the sense that unless you're packing a perfectly symmetrical object, you're going to kind of miss the boat on this. Instead of starting out with our pieces cut here, we're going to adjust them to actually fit the object we're dealing with. Imagine that. So as I pointed out, we came down and realized that it was going to be 9 1/4 inches to the center of this, to the center of the contact point that is right where we want it. And then we want to figure out how far in we're coming, which looks like about 4 3/8 inches in. Which will put us right there. This side, the other side, stepping across, we came forward 6 inches, as I recall. So here are our 2 points that we want to start out with. That we determined by measuring up there. And then we're just going to make it be flat this way. And if you don't want to mark it exactly this way, you could have just been cutting that, obviously, and not marking it. In this case, I think it's useful, though, to actually mark it out. So those are going to be the 2 pieces. The thing that you notice is it's a little off-center this way. This is not equal to this. That's actually really groovy because you got to remember that we've got, in the back, we're quite flat, and in the front, we're projecting out. So that actually represents, you know, the piece as we know it to be if we think about it. Don't get caught up in aesthetics of your brace. All right, so here we've got our 2 pieces that are our starting blanks. And this, basically, we're going to use to cut out the pieces that we need to slide this back and contact the actual sculpture. One thing that we're not going to do, though, is if this is how we want it to end up, this is not how we're going to cut it. And this makes sense if you think about it. In fact, we want to cut the back side first. So the usefulness of the base, in this case, is going to be just so we can spin it around and have it in basically the same location, only inverted. So I'm going to measure these points here, and then I'm going to spin it around, and we'll start on the back. Okay, so here we have the piece reversed. At this point, I would point out a couple things. Normally, if you're doing a side, you do all your braces, you know, on one side while it's in one place. And starting out with a front facing was good for illustrative purposes, but generally what that was to tell you is that when you go to set this up, you want to set it up with the back facing you first. That said, here we'll go ahead and do some form finding. There's a variety of different ways to find forms for contour packing. It's like kind of the thing that is intimidating about this. There are folks who use wire and will go in and bend it and get it to try and keep the shape of the piece, and then transfer that over to the foam, or sometimes to a piece of cardboard. There are woodworkers have contour gauges that have a series of little plastic fingers that you can put up against like molding. That can be good for some small things. Frankly, that's not big enough to do what we normally want. And then also there are gauges that are homemade gauges that utilize coroplast with a bunch of thin rods that function in the same way, only on a larger scale. The problem with all of them is that if you find this form, you can get that accurately, but then you have to get it on something going this way, and getting it at just the right angle is tough. You almost have to put it in there with a sheet that's already locked in here as a reference point. So sometimes you get that form, cut it out of a piece of cardboard, slide another piece of cardboard in this slot, and then you can just shoot a couple dabs of glue and match the two. When you put them together, they'll be the exact shape of your bracket. The more down and dirty way to do this, that is, works pretty well, I think, actually, is to use some scrap foam that hopefully you have anyway. And we're going to make a little tool to help us do it in place, with the brace in place. But basically what I want to do is this thing, to be where I want it, it needs to go in exactly this much. That much is a known. So right there that is going to determine how deep my cut needs to be at its deepest point, which is right back here off this shoulder. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to cut it maybe a hair long, because what I'll do is I'll make a little notch, and that's right where my pencil, my Sharpie or whatever I'm using is going to go. I'll help hold it in place. And then I'm going to cut the front of this to a point, making sure not to make it any shorter. And then I'm going to use that and move it along the surface of the piece, making sure that I maintain contact with where I want it to cut, and that I keep this this perpendicular so it accurately reflects the contour. The temptation can be to like rotate this way as you go around the shape of it, and then you lose the cut, because basically this needs to go straight in. All right, so I'm basically on this outside surface, and I'm going to slowly move this along and let the pointer contact right with the edge of the object. Trying to keep this point straight out from that point as much as is possible. So that should basically line up with wherever the shoulder goes. So now I'll take this and cut it with a knife. Alright, so here I've taken the outline that I made using the little guide and just cut a straight cut, because I measured at the top part of this contour. It slopes out a little bit, so that's what you want. You want the furthest in on a given surface. So when I go to put this in here, it's going to come up, and it'll be, when you press it up, about 5/8 of an inch gap between here and the actual surface on the top, because of the angle and out here. So this depth here tells you how much you need to cut off on this other side. And if you want to, you can, just as a reference point, come down here and confirm your marks, because it may not be consistent. So basically I need to make cuts that go in here at that angle. All right, now that I've cut this back, I've rounded off this edge so it's going to be nice and sweet. It goes in there and we've got the contact we want. We can at this point, if we're going to cover the area with some kind of surface contact material, we do that now. But the other side of it is we may want to go a little bit further and take it to the next level, in which case we can add more foam here if there's something that we feel like isn't getting adequate support. We can come in underneath. We could even go on edge if we want to, as long as it's cut flush with the back of this. And then, or we can go up top and broaden it out by applying, extra foam here and basically gain a lot more surface area. Just depends on the piece, the material, etc. So that went pretty smoothly. Strangely enough, that was pretty much, you're not going to get too much quicker than that. It's basically 2 cuts. Don't figure that's going to happen. It doesn't normally happen with me either. You have to fine tune typically. Sometimes you can make bigger boo-boos though, and that's where a couple things come in, and one that I mentioned earlier. Here's a blank that basically fits the idea of the crate. Just to be sane, always have an extra 1 or 2 of these. If you bring them, then you won't need them. If you don't have them, you will mess yourself up. But another thing you can do in this case is get blanks that are longer and fit the width. The reason for that is if you do have a miscut, and you go, oh man, and you need to cut some more, and all of a sudden this starts sinking inside of the crate, it's like you're not stuck trying to scab little strips on there or do whatever. Instead, you can just keep carving, hopefully not too long, but keep carving until you've got your fit. And when that is where you want it, then basically get it exactly lined up. You do this, you make a mark, you make a cut, and this is perfectly lined up for the back side. Okay, so we cut our basic foam kind of contour braces earlier. Here is an example of up where I don't even want to touch the projection, so I'm just contacting this back surface area. And where we're contacting our sculpture, we have a couple options. One being just the Tyvek that's tucked in here. That's kind of a good thing. You can mess around a little bit underneath there, and since you're covering it up, if you have to add some material back where you carve too much, that's very doable. Another option, if you are pretty dead on, which does happen occasionally, and you feel really good about your fit, you can always go in and do a heat weld thing, which looks quite nice. It's just a matter of using your heat gun, and you have an extra wide strip, and start in the middle and just heat it and push it in place and work your way out. Then it'll be sticking out, and you just trim it. And so that's one thing that can be a nice thing, gives a nice finished look. So those are a couple of the basic things for foam guillotines. Next we move up to plywood. So what we talked about earlier in terms of when you're finding that form, the problem is how to relate that to the actual dimensions and plane of the yoke or guillotine itself. So that's why working straight off something that slides in there can be really good. And you can either do the trace kind of thing that I did earlier. Another option, though, that you have is to use a piece of cardboard, do a rough cut that gets you close, and then since you're using typically you'd have a glue gun fired up when you're doing this. Take advantage of the fact you've got a glue gun, because basically you can cut a bunch of little pieces of cardboard, put a bead of glue, just stick it on there and slide it into place. If they get too close, sometimes you can even kind of, this matches here, this matches, you can even overlap for that part in the middle. Then basically that does a super accurate form of what you've got, and you just trace this onto your plywood. You can then take the foam you're going to use to cut it and subtract that. All right, once we're reasonably confident about the shape we're gonna have there, and we want to attach some foam, you kind of immediately foresee a problem that you've got a fair amount of weight that you're holding with this, but you've got a fairly small amount of surface area. If you're doing 2 inches on this, you can see that's not going to be terribly stable. In fact, it's not going to be stable at all. Even going 1 inch, if only that thick, which you do see those just glued that way, I'm never comfortable with that. What you can do, though, is to broaden out your area of foam contact in a couple different ways. The first one is to go ahead and just use more foam. We want to get something closer to this or this in terms of contact area. And the one way to do that is to glue down a strip that goes across here and then cut it to fit. And you'll do this on both sides. And then you can come in and glue a broader strip to the face of it and trim it all up. So that's what you end up with. The nice thing about that too is the fact that you have this foam around here means that you can have something to tuck into. The whole Tyvek tuck is a very, very nice thing. If you need to come in here and say maybe instead of subtract, if you've got to a place where you cut too much, you need to put in a little wedge or do some building, you can do that, and it will be hidden by the Tyvek cut, which is a beautiful thing. And in doing that, there's a couple options about how to approach it. One is that when you glue this in initially, you're going to shoot a bead of glue here, but not the outer edge. So you'd glue around here, but not all the way out. And doing that will leave you with a way to do a sort of general tuck over the whole thing, the whole shape that you've got, whatever it is. So that's pretty beautiful. That's pretty nice. If you're concerned about that, don't feel like that's enough glue, and you like really are concerned about reinforcing this more. And maybe you're using 2.2 instead of this is 1.7 for the sake of demonstration. The other thing you can do is by having this be broad enough, you can just do a standard kind of tuck where you make a cut that echoes that shape, and then you can come in and tuck it, and it looks pretty beautiful too. So that's going to come around and cover your cushion material. So if you do have something heavy or sometimes a complex shape, you can always, the good thing about having something solid like this is you can add to it. You can actually add separate braces if you need to that come up and do other things, but also you can just broaden this contact area in a little bit more of an affirmative way. And the nice thing about this is you can do it just by using wood blocks. The nice thing about this is since you have a glue gun, you basically can get it and do any adjustment that you want to do. Either you can push it a little bit if you want to move the foam that way, you could back it up a little bit. So the foam will give up to a certain point and then stop. And the idea would be you'd get all this figured out and basically glue these in place before you screw them. So you just did a shot of glue on there, push in place, a shot of glue on it. You get them all stuck on there. It'll hold it in place for you. So you then go back with your screws. So you get the best of both worlds. And so that's kind of like what you're going to be doing in a normal situation. This is, I should point out, that this is all where this is kind of a primary box. If we were trying to lock this in place, then and have this be an inner box and contained in an outer crate, then we'd have a couple different approaches. All right, now we're going to talk about a method for much larger things. If we're using plywood, that already implies some weight, but when you get to another scale, you still have the foam contact issue, but also just the strength issue that can come in. So this is going to be a scaled down version, obviously. So you just have to keep in mind the proportions are going to be somewhat different. But it's fairly straightforward. So we're going to we have our guillotine here marked out. We're using the same kind of transfer method to get our pattern. And then we're going to cut it just the same way that we would with the other. But in this case, what we have, you see the two screws, we're going to cut two at the same time. So two pieces of 1/2 inch, or in some cases it could even be thinner, because we're going to put them together to make basically a box beam style brace. So one cut, and then of course we'll separate these, and there'll be a nice match that will separate with strips of wood. So we'll end up with something broader like that. It'll be incredibly strong. All right, so basically you're going to box in the edges, get any place where you can make a rectangle or a solid shape to strengthen it's good. Remember, this is out of scale. These could be 2x4s or 2x3s, or even potentially 1xs that are thicker. Just depends on what you need. I've seen them up to 2x6s in this part, put together with the skin, and so we've got all of the perimeter all boxed in. And then here, just so we don't have just two floating pieces of contoured plywood to attach to, we put in these blocks that line the two up. You can even take them and put them crossways in areas that are larger, to give yourself larger surface areas for either attaching foam or getting a little more fancy. So there's our box beam brace put together. Anybody who knows anything about box beams is like, for architecture, for building purposes, they're amazingly strong. For the strength to weight ratio is pretty impressive. And so we've got a nice strip of wood around here, which is really handy. You can see the blocks. We can have We have the cross blocks where we have something to attach our foam to as we put it in there. So this is an option as you get bigger to consider. So obviously when you're using this kind of beam, a brace, the box beam style, it's going to be something pretty massive. It could be a giant stone. That's where I've used them. And you know, there in particular, you want to be able to strengthen the box as much as possible, because you know, you can only do so much without, you know, putting railroad ties up the side of your crate or whatever. And by isolating these planes in here, you're strengthening the whole thing a massive amount. So in this case, you might be actually going through. You know, you find your middle, go through, pre-drill a little bit, and be lagging in. Or in some cases, if it's going to travel some, you might actually be bolting and putting bolt plates here, and possibly even recessed into the side of this. So it's all you can replicate it basically. Okay, so on our guillotines or yoke braces or contour braces, there's one thing that is common to all of them, as far as I'm concerned. It's sort of a general notion, and that is that anything that you can secure, you do secure. So on a foam type of brace, go ahead and glue these in the back. I mean, for one thing, it just keeps it from being as confusing. It keeps them from getting out of sync, out of register, makes it less of a puzzle. It means something can't get lost. So there's always that benefit. But in addition to that, it strengthens things a bit, especially when it comes to dealing with the wood. You know, as things get heavier. Here's our little sample plywood brace here. Especially in this case, you've got a cross plane back here that you're screwing into place, and that rigidifies it significantly. So even if you're leaving this entirely loose up here, you've really strengthened the box a lot. One easy way to make sure to do that and to make sure you're hitting it, because it's kind of narrow and you want to hit it pretty much dead on, is when you have your rails that are set up like that, you know, go ahead and screw them from the inside and pop them all the way through, and you'll see the mark. So then you can, you know, potentially put a little wood glue on them, slide them back into place, and screw them, and you know, you're dead on. It's a done deal. You can, in fact, if you want to, go ahead and attach the front ones as well. You just need to make sure people know it's removable. Obviously, you need to do a circle or whatever kind of key you want to use. So those are the variations that I'm most familiar with using contour packing, especially in crates. Varies from the lightweight foam, which normally you'd be using a 2.2 pound. I normally wouldn't do it with a lighter foam, up to plywood, and then finally up to a box beam style.